Good evening and welcome to our final webinar in the Practice Dialogue series with Rahim Thawer and SACAP's Social Work and Community Development faculty. This evening we'll be chatting about how counselors and workers can support clients and their families when someone comes up. So without any further ado, Rahim, I will now hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. This is our last session together in the Practice Dialogue. I got some good feedback from our last session together where we talked about shame, and the one before that where we talked about harm reduction. So thank you for those personal emails, comments, and follows. I really appreciate it. I began thinking about this topic not only because I'm a queer person, but because as a queer person and as a therapist, I know that when LGBTQI people begin learning about themselves and begin feeling comfortable telling other people who they are, they often find that there's an incredible burden to educate people around them. And they're doing this kind of education at a time when they are themselves still figuring things out. And it's not that they don't know who they are, but they haven't been given an opportunity to develop responses to all of the things people are asking them. So what I'd like to do today is share 3 case examples with you. 2 of them are going to be of young people that a hypothetical social worker is working with in a child welfare agency. And then we're going to talk about how the worker might intervene. And I'll give you a bit of a spoiler alert that I cannot do a talk without also talking about the dynamics of culture and race, because we are more than just one identity. And so I want us to think about how does our cultural bias interfere or disrupt with how we intervene. And then we'll look at another case of an older man who's coming out later in life. Altogether, as I read at these case scenarios, what I'd love for you as the participant to do is to write out questions you might have for each of these 3 people. Questions like, they don't have to be therapeutic questions, but questions you're genuinely curious about. And you don't have to share them in the chat box, but it'll be a useful exercise if you're able to just write them down. Because what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go through about 9 common questions LGBTQI people receive when they do come out. And I'm going to provide responses to those. So it would be interesting to see if some of the questions you have noted are captured in the ones that I've listed. Then I want to talk briefly about what it means to be an ally and what that can look like. There is, in fact, a spectrum of acceptance. And then I want to leave us with new operating assumptions, which means a new way to look at the world, a new way to think about these critical issues around support for gender and sexual minorities. And then we'll have quite a bit of time, I suspect about half an hour, if not a bit more, for questions and answers. So I would encourage you to make use of the Q&A box so that this can be a vibrant dialogue. Let's talk about Jodi. So this is from the perspective of the worker. Jodi is 13 years old and white. I met Jodi when she was assigned to one of the foster families we work with at the child welfare agency. I would do monthly home visits to see how she was adjusting to her new home. She was somewhat withdrawn for the first couple of visits until I started to see more of her personality, and her performance in school was on a steady incline. I received a call from Jodi's school one afternoon when Jodi refused to participate in physical education and had a quote unquote meltdown as described by one of her teachers. Jodi couldn't explain the despair and anguish she was experiencing to her teachers or foster parents. But she opened up to me about wanting to fit in with the boys. And I knew exactly what was needed. Ongoing conversation about gender identity, education for teachers and parents, supporting new pronoun use with time, and connection to peer and affirming services. I did it. I helped in a way that others couldn't, and it made all the difference. So think about Jodi for a moment. Only 13. She is the pronoun she uses right now, is having a difficult time in gendered spaces. And the worker is able to provide a certain kind of safety, a certain kind of allyship, which allows Jodi to talk a bit more. And there's no pathologizing that she wants to fit in with the boys. It's merely a conversation about who do you see yourself being more like? How would you like to fit in? What does that mean for you? And how does it feel when you have to be in the girl side of things, right? So we're talking about a conversation and coming from a knowledgeable place of how to be an ally for somebody who's questioning their gender. That's Jodi, 13 years old. Let's talk about Rais. So Rais is 15 and colored. As you can tell by his name, it's also a Muslim name. Rais got into a physical altercation at school early in the school term, and he was suspended for 2 weeks. He was so upset, he didn't want to return to school, but his parents were adamant that he return promptly and demanded that he turn things around in order to bring home better grades and to get into university. Rais returned to school, but simply couldn't keep up with the work, so he started skipping school. Once his parents found out, there was a huge blow up at home. At which point the neighbors called the police, and then child welfare was notified so they could pursue an investigation. The family reluctantly entered a program for parent-teen conflict. When I, the worker, met Rais, his affect was warm and calm. He told jokes and seemed quite bright. I almost couldn't believe he was engaged in conflict. When I talked to him about his truancy, meaning his habitual missing of school, he shared that people at school were spreading rumors about his sexual orientation, and he got really upset. I wanted to ask him more about his sexuality, but I only had one individual session with him before meeting with the whole family. When the family came together, Rais talked mostly about the weight and pressure of family expectations, uncertainty about whether or not post-secondary was right for him, and wanting to find work so he could live on his own in a couple of years. His parents could not understand his perspective, and I wondered if there was a connection between the rumors at school, his actual journey in questioning his sexuality, the ambivalence around school, and the resistance toward his parents' well-intentioned but overbearing career mapping. Still, I could not bring myself to bring up sexuality or the rumors in front of his parents. They were from a different culture from myself, and I was worried it might only make things worse. By 16, Rais aged out of the child welfare programs. It didn't look like he was going to complete high school, but he had found work and he was living at a youth shelter temporarily. Now, when we think about Rais, I do again want you to encourage you to write down questions you might have for him, questions about his journey, his sexuality, same with Jodi. And you could put those in the chat box, or you could just write them down and keep them to you. All or both are acceptable. If you do put them in the chat box, I will later read them without naming the people who have put them forward. I want us to think about a few things as from the perspective of the workers. There was a case in which a worker was happy to step in and talk about gender identity. There was another case where a worker was not so eager to step in and talk about sexual orientation. So what was the difference between these two situations? Now, it makes me think that the worker perhaps perceived that they would be more welcome to intervene and to even talk about sexuality or gender identity with a young person who comes from a white family. It might have also been a difference in the neighborhood and the school. Some schools are more outwardly LGBTI affirming, and that can make it easier for a social worker to talk about some of those issues. They may also have different religious backgrounds. Rais is clearly a Muslim name. There's lots of LGBTQ Muslims in the world. I am one of them. But there are lots of assumptions about how a Muslim family or a practicing religious family of any sort might respond if these issues were brought up. So what made these two people that different? Jodi received a safe space and Rais didn't. He received something. The worker didn't do anything explicitly wrong. But I do think the worker's anxiety left an impact. What else can we explore in this setting? I can't help but wonder why the worker would feel empowered to support the young person in one situation while being apprehensive in another. The worker does say, I'm from a different cultural background, and I don't want to make things worse. So what could they do? What could the worker do? What would make the worker feel more apprehensive? It also makes us think about what the anxieties specifically are that the worker is experiencing, right? It's not just this person's from a different cultural background from me or a different religious community, and so I'll get a bad response. It could also be that the worker doesn't feel comfortable. So if Rais starts to say, well, some of the rumors are true, or it started because I like a boy in my school and I told him, or someone caught me scrolling through Instagrams of gay celebrities. And that would give us some context, but the worker would have to be comfortable to talk about issues related to LGBTQI experiences, right? I think sometimes when we're anxious to hear a story, it's because we perceive it as a tube of toothpaste, where when the toothpaste comes out of the tube, it can't be put back in, right? It's too messy. And so there might be anxiety on the worker's end about their own competency. So let's put up the rest of the bullet points. Now, if we wanted to develop a stage-wise plan for supporting someone like Rais, this time addressing his sexuality, my question is, what would that look like? Now, stage-wise means, let's think about the things we want to talk about, and let's think about the things that we have to get to. What order do we want to do them in, right? And so here I'd be thinking, can we adjust the frame? The therapeutic frame is a language that's used for how a therapist or social worker operates. What is their routine? What is their way of doing things? How do we adjust that frame to make sense for someone like Rais? Is there a chance that we could offer him an extra individual session? Is there a chance that we could see him, see the family, and then see him one-on-one again? Can we bring in another worker who might be more comfortable to talk about sexuality? And once we do talk to him, Rais, and we have a one-on-one session, an extra session, what are we going to ask him? Are these rumors true? What do you want to tell me? Can you tell me a bit more about this idea you have about what can you tell me about like who you have told or who you can confide in, right? What can you tell me about why you want to leave your family home in 2 years? Tell me a bit about that motivation, right? Because there could be so many reasons. And we might also say, you know, there's some youth LGBTQ support groups. Is that something you want to go to? Then we could say, can you imagine talking to your parents about this? What do you think the reaction would be? And then we can go into, would you want to tell your parents? And if so, would you want me to be there? What do you imagine the consequences will be? And how could I support you? If you don't want to tell them, that's also fine. How can I support you while we also honor your journey? And what specifically is tough about school? Is it in fact the academics, or is it the weight of the toxic environment that you're experiencing? Now, I'm just going to go to the chat box and see what some of the comments have been, because there are a few questions there that people have asked that are not questions to me, but questions they'd want to ask these in these settings. So what does Rais feel makes this so upsetting? And is it upsetting? Actually, I'm not sure what you mean by school versus legal guardianship, but I guess that's also about how does it feel to have the police involved, to have child welfare involved? What other pressures does that bring on him? And would it have been helpful if there was somebody in his school environment that could have helped him much sooner before suspending him? Someone else says, I feel the worker would have needed to reflect on their own feelings and emotions regarding LGBTQI people. And is there any underlying bias toward this population? And who would the clients be most comfortable with? People in school, people with the child welfare worker. And we need to ask this question of like, what does it mean to come out to colleagues, peers, students, coworkers in a mostly heteronormative environment? Heteronormative meaning an environment where heterosexuality is presumed to be the norm. Let's go further. I'm going to give you a very different scenario where a worker might also intervene. It's not a child welfare worker though, and this person is certainly not a youth. Sthembiso is 42 years old, Black. Sthembiso grew up in a township just outside Johannesburg and continued to live there after he got married at age 27. His wife moved to live with him, and he worked hard to provide for his household as well as his aging parents. He has one son. He and his wife wanted more children, but it wasn't possible for them. Their son is almost done high school and will be heading to university, the first in their family. Sthembiso is thinking about having a conversation with his wife. He wants to tell his wife that he's bisexual. You see, his work allowed him to move in and around out of the city and meet a variety of people. He has worked as a photographer, a tour operator, and events planner since his early 20s. His work exposed him to many same-sex couples, and he always felt envious of them. He also had sexual encounters with a few of his clients over the years. He felt absolutely terrible about betraying his wife. However, he couldn't imagine telling her. As his counselor, you ask, what would come of it? Would you expect her to be okay with this? Do you feel that this is important to talk about now? And how sure are you that you want to do this? What will your end goal be? Do you just want her to know? Or do you want there to be an open marriage? Or do you want them to separate? So these are questions you ask yourself, you ask him. What would come of it? Would he expect her to be okay with it? If he feels he's important to talk about, what is his end goal? Does he just want her to know? Does he want them to be in an open marriage? Or does he want them to separate? Now, I know we've already got things in the chat box, so I'm going to go back to those for a moment. So someone comments, there's lots of challenges of finding an identity when labels are seen as so negative. These individuals may not need labels, but rather just someone who can support them, even at a minimal level. That's quite true. It's tricky, though. Sometimes labels aren't important, and other times they're incredibly important. Sometimes people reject labels because they come with a lot of stigma, but it's actually internalized stigma that makes them distance themselves from that label. And yet, some people are in a place in their life where identity labels can be confusing. They cause a lot of conflict. Another person says, I don't have a specific question, but these cases make me think about broader LGBTQI experiences within their milieu and how these experiences impact their behavior. This is certainly something to take into account as a therapist and apply different theories and concepts of family structures, relationships, or attachment styles while exploring the client's healing journey. Yes, I'm glad you said that. I'll just touch on that a little bit because you talked about attachment styles. A common attachment style that we talk about is the avoidant attachment style, the person who becomes compulsively self-reliant. And I think for a lot of LGBTQI people, if they grew up in an environment where they anticipated rejection from a young age, they might absolutely become more of an avoidant become more avoidantly attached. That means self-reliant, less likely to talk about their feelings. They might feel overwhelmed by emotion. They might be conflict avoidant, etc. Now, let's go on and talk about the questions, the common questions. So, many years ago, I was doing a workshop for allies of LGBTQ Muslims in Canada. And I did it in collaboration with 4 other people. And we put out a survey and asked people what their questions were. And so there was a range of questions, but the few you're going to see here today are ones that I've drawn from that question bank because they just came up over and over. So let's tackle the first one. Someone comes out and a spouse or a parent or a sibling might say, how did this happen? Now, this is an interesting question because if you ask how something happened, what you're suggesting is that something might have occurred that then propelled someone to question their gender or sexual identity. There's this idea that your life was going fine and then something bad happened and it made things turn for the worse. Well, what is that thing? Lots of people assume or suspect that it was because of an absent father, or maybe they assume it's because you experienced some kind of abuse. Other people might suggest this happened because my child or my spouse was influenced by all those tourists, influenced by media, influenced by TikTok, influenced by popular culture, or that terrible school he goes to. Maybe people think about LGBTQ identities and communities as a very specialized kind of cult where people are indoctrinated and coerced. Others might think that there's a Western influence, that someone identifying as LGBTQI even questioning their gender or sexual identity, is an extension of colonialism that needs to be resisted. People will often suggest that a queer or gender sexual minority identity is something that has been nurtured. It's as a result of one's environment, as opposed to somebody being born that way. So, as I said before, LGBTQI people are inundated with questions like this, and they have to answer them. But how? How would I answer such a question if I just finally got the bravery to tell you something important about me? How would I have the knowledge, the skills, the tools, the language to be able to explain this? So if somebody were to ask, how did this happen? Whether I'm a social worker, a therapist, a registered counselor, or just an ally, a family member that wants to help, I might respond by saying, well, nothing really happened. Instead, just as somebody explores their interests, explores their career, and cycles through friendships at different developmental stages, in the same way, there's a kind of self-discovery that happens around sexuality and gender identity. And so nothing has happened except that I've grown up and I've explored and I've contemplated and I've put language to my experience. So I don't think we need to ask, how did this happen? We also don't need to have a debate about nature versus nurture. I think we should throw the whole debate into the garbage, and I'll tell you why. Because when we ask this question, we're looking for a gay gene. We're trying to say, is there something different or something wrong with your DNA that made you this way? Is there some kind of hormonal imbalance that you're experiencing that has made you more like this? And if someone were to ask me that, I think I would say, I'm more curious to know what gene made straight people straight. Is there a gene that makes it difficult for straight people to stay in their marriages instead of succumbing to a 40 to 50% divorce rate? Is there a gene that makes straight people more likely to commit murder or other kinds of offenses? No, I don't think we need to look for a gene. I think we need to accept that if somebody is doing something good or somebody is doing something bad, yes, that is a function of their environment. But sexuality is not about good or bad. It just is. So just as people might think that I became gay or that something happened, I would say, you could ask the same question to a straight person and say, when did you become straight? When did you know you were heterosexual? The thing that gets missed often is that we live in a world where heterosexuality is presumed and compulsory. So straight people and cisgender people, meaning non-trans people, rarely have to come out. It's just assumed that they are. And they don't know that they're heterosexual from a young age. They're taught that they are. And then when they get old enough and they can put feelings and words together, they start to describe their own experience as being consistent with what the culture has told them. What's another common question? Can they try to be straight or cisgender? Can they pray to be straight or cisgender? This question gives me pause, because if people grew up in a straight world, I promise you, they've already tried. Who hasn't tried to fit in to a group that is dominant and more popular? Who hasn't tried to please their community, their mosque, or their church? Who hasn't tried to not disappoint their families and their parents. People who say that they've gone to conversion therapy or reparative therapy and they've experienced success, I would say that the success they've experienced is actually not about eradicating their sexuality, but they've been successful at repression, at being really good actors, and about subjugating their own emotional and physical material needs. I'm going to make a recommendation for people to look up the film that's called For the Bible Tells Me So. You'll see a cameo from Desmond Tutu in that film. This film shows a number of people who are connected to the church and their families and their journeys of acceptance, but also non-acceptance. And there's people who are very knowledgeable about theology who advocate for the inclusion of LGBTQ people within the church. A similar film in the Jewish community would be called Trembling Before God. And another one, if you're Muslim, could be Jihad for Love. There are many, many more films. But what I like about films is that they can educate in a way that sometimes conversation cannot. Now, when we ask someone to pray the gay away, we actually do a lot of harm because we're asking them to turn to a religious and spiritual system that they were taught was forgiving and accepting and that loved them. And now we're turning them to that same system and saying, hey, I want you to ask for help, for forgiveness. I want you to repent and I want you to pray to try and change. And if you don't, you're not just disappointing me, you're disappointing a higher being and your community, and you're going against what your purpose in the world is. How awful to have to internalize that message and to have to hear that from somebody you love. You'll see in the film For the Bible Tells Me So that one of the young people who was encouraged to try to suppress her sexuality ended up dying by suicide. And that is an extremely common occurrence in the LGBTQI community. And it makes me think how awful that people would have to turn away from a place of prayer, a sanctuary, because of judgment about who they're attracted to. They're attracted to people of the same gender or multiple genders, despite living in a world where heterosexuality is often compulsory and presumed, where you're not part of the dominant group. It's unlikely that you would choose to be part of a minority group and have a difficult life. You probably also already have cried and tried and prayed to fit in, but couldn't. And then you have other people telling you that that's what you have to do more of. And then they might say, well, we can love the sinner, but not the sin. Now your sexuality, which is completely healthy and normal, has been stripped away from you. Another question that people will ask is, what if I take my child or my partner or my sibling to a doctor or a counselor? I think that that's not a bad idea, but the counseling is not going to be for the person who is LGBTQI. The counseling is going to be focused on helping family members talk about their grief, what makes this topic hard to talk about, how the LGBTQI person can now fit into the existing religious or cultural community. And it's going to be a conversation about acceptance. It's going to be a conversation about what people need and what they're still trying to understand. The counselor can be a facilitator to help amplify the voice of the LGBTQI person, to help the family members understand what this person's going through. But that's not what people mean when they first ask, can counseling help? What they mean, or what they tend to mean, is, can I send my child to counseling to help him change or help them become different, help them be straight, help them to let go of whatever this is. Now, if you tell someone, well, if you go to counseling, it's not going to be to change the person in your life who's come out, it's going to be to change you. The next thing they might think about is, hey, have I failed as a parent? Whew, this is a hard one, because for parents or family members, there probably are a lot of emotions. But you didn't fail because the person in your family is LGBTQI, but if they really felt like they couldn't tell you for a very long time, yes, there may be a failure on your part for not creating an environment where that was possible. But parenting is a lifelong journey, as is being a supportive family member, whether it's a spouse or someone else. And so where we had a blind spot, we can now have awareness. When you ask yourself if you failed as parents, you actually make this coming out experience about you. And that is usually not helpful. And one of the things you might have to recognize is that if you feel like a failure, that means that you likely subscribe to this idea of something happened to my child to make them this way. And now you're thinking the thing that happened to them was me. But what are the ways parents can even imagine themselves failing? Maybe being absent, working too much, allowing them to play with certain peers, go to certain schools. If parents are religious, they might feel like they weren't pious enough. They weren't religious enough. They lied, they cheated, and they're now being punished in some way. Mostly, if you feel like you failed as a parent, that's a reflection of the kinds of social circles you move around in. Before the person in your family came out to you, would you have looked at another family in your community and said, hey, their child is gay or bisexual or lesbian or transgender? There must be something wrong with the parenting. That is a kind of pain that you have to live with. But that is the pain of you being judgmental towards someone else, and you now have an opportunity to change. To build on this idea of, is this a form of punishment? So like I said, is it, was I not pious enough? Did I cheat? Did I lie? Did I not go to mosque or church? Did I do something wrong in my life? Some people might even suggest this is a test from God. But what is the test? And why do we frame things that way? If somebody is struggling with dire poverty and you said to them, do you think this is a test from God? That would be completely unacceptable. No, they're not poor because God is testing them. They're poor because we live in a capitalist world where some people are allowed to hoard wealth and others have nothing. And we've normalized that. There's no test of God. And when we frame things as a test of God, what we're saying is that what you're dealing with can be overcome with some work. And now we go back to trying to make the person who is LGBTQI more like the straight person. And you'll notice all of the questions I've asked so far come from a heterosexual lens, as though to be heterosexual or cisgender is normal or natural. It's merely more common. With gay men in particular, there are often questions around sexual health and promiscuity. So someone might ask, are you doing sex work? Are you having sex with men? Are you promiscuous? Do you have HIV or are you at risk for HIV? And some of those questions aren't awful. They're overwhelming, but they're not awful. And I would say to people, let's say you have more than one child and one of your children comes out to you, and you're suddenly curious about sex work, promiscuity, and sexual health. Before you jump in and ask these questions, I would ask yourself, would you ask your other straight children the same questions? There are many families where people feel quite uncomfortable talking about sex and sexuality at any age. And so if you've been uncomfortable talking about these things in your household for a long time, why would you expect that the person who came out to you is going to be able to talk to you about this specific thing? After all, when people come out, they're usually telling you about their identity. They're telling you about who they are. It's unlikely that they're trying to tell you about their deepest fantasies. They're not trying to tell you about their sex life. They're not trying to tell you about their relationship to sex and sexuality. If you have that kind of relationship, then maybe you can ask. A lot of families don't. Now, I will say for the community of gay men, we have been disproportionately affected by HIV, but so have a lot of other communities. And so instead of asking yes or no questions, it might be more like, thank you for telling me. And if at a later time you want to talk about sexual health, or you want to go to a clinic, or you want to get information together, let me know. Then comes the pride parades and the visibility. This is a hallmark of coming out. This is what people think about when they think about coming out. And a common question is, I get that you're out. I get that you're different. We accept you as our family member, but why do you need to tell everyone? And this is a difficult one to answer. My response would be precisely because it makes people uncomfortable and they would prefer that I be silent. I think it's important that I tell them. How do I help reduce other people's isolation if I am not vocal and visible? Also, who benefits and who actually loses out if I'm not visible? And how are my family members impacted if I'm visible? They should talk about that. They should say, I appreciate your bravery for being able to tell other people. Let me know if you're ever worried or anxious or apprehensive, or if you get a bad response. Or now that you're telling more people, what if somebody comes and asks me, is there something you want me to say or not say? It's much better. It's much better. Now, I get that we live in a culture that's made up of many, many cultures. And in some cultures, explicit pride is frowned upon, right? We are taught often to celebrate humility and be humble. And the idea of pride is contrary to that. So that does bring up a kind of complexity. And I would say that's why we need to be able to allow the LGBTQI person to decide how visible and how out and loud and proud they want to be. I would also say that there's an inclination to quote unquote tell everyone, because sexuality and gender permeate just about every aspect of life. I'll give you an example. If I were to go to a family wedding, isn't that couple and everybody around me flaunting their heterosexuality? Aren't they all telling me about their relationship? If I want to take a partner, I have to do some work beforehand. I can't just assume that my same-sex partner would be invited or allowed or accepted. Let's say I want to go to church, go to a mosque. If that spiritual practice or that faith is a big part of my life, I'm going to want to know how I fit in. Other people's responses are going to be important to me. If somebody said to me, you should just go to the mosque, don't worry about what other people think, your relationship is just with Allah, and that should be enough. I would say to some degree they're right. And I would also say no. I've grown up knowing that there's a cultural and community aspect to my religious practice. I cannot separate culture and social community from the practice of my faith. So if the very people I'm going to be around don't know who I am and aren't going to accept me, I don't necessarily want to be there. Now, when we talk about advocacy and being visible, right? For a lot of people, our sexual identity is not super visible. It can be sometimes, but it isn't always. So telling people is about our pride and is about our liberation. And when I think about liberation, I think about someone who was once previously carrying 20 textbooks in one backpack and carrying it around everywhere. If I realized that by coming out and sharing my story, I only have 2 textbooks, or it feels like I only have 2 textbooks in my backpack, why would I ever imagine going back to carrying 18 more of those? It doesn't serve me. I would want to not do that ever again. All right, last couple questions. And we'll just put them both up on the screen and I'll go for it. So people might say this is a Western thing. Why do we not know queer or trans people growing up? That's very interesting. I would say that it probably wasn't a safe time for them to come out. Or you probably had an inkling and you had a word for them or a name for them, and that name was not nice. You also may have seen effeminate men or butch women and just made some assumptions about them and went on your business. Or you might have relegated them to particular domains and areas of society. You might have said, well, yeah, that guy was gay, but he became a hairdresser and I like him, but I only like him when he's my hairdresser, not outside that setting. Now, if colonization has done anything, it has been to strengthen homophobia, because colonization came with a very specific kind of Christian teaching. And this isn't a critique on Christianity, but it is a critique on the way colonialism entrenched ways to be, in the same way that Zionist culture entrenched ways to be, as opposed to saying we are many, many people with many different cultures and many different relationships to Christianity. The colonial powers made Christianity one monolithic thing. And that is where the harm comes in, particularly in this context. One model, one form of interpretation, no separation of church and state. That's where the harm is done. So I would encourage people who have said, I don't know any LGBTQI people. I would say, go back to your childhood and look at the people around you. Who was there that you ignored? Or look around you now at people that are your age, if you're an older person, and find out LGBTQI people in that age group and have a conversation with them. Ask them what it was like growing up. Ask them if they came from a similar township as you did and what that was like. What were the gender expectations? What was the whole experience if you had to go to a ceremony for circumcision and you were around a particular kind of masculinity and you were taught about what a man is, but those teachings didn't include being an LGBTQI person? The last question that people often ask is, how can I support my child and where can I get support? I'm going to answer that in the next few slides when I talk about how to be an ally. But before we go forward, there are some fabulous comments and questions in the chat box. So I'm just going to read them out so everyone can get the benefit of some of these comments. A person says, as an individual who has experienced being asked many questions, I find it difficult to manage my thoughts in terms of, are they being rude or insensitive, or obliviously curious and not knowing? Are they being homophobic, or are they trying to learn? I struggle to tell if I'm being attacked or being asked to teach. That is a beautiful comment, and I'll say something about that. Whenever you get a question that feels outrageous, it's probably because it is, and it's a microaggression, whether the intent is good or bad, right? When you experience something as a microaggression, it's because you're being othered, you're being seen as not the norm, and it's coming from a place of dominance. And so it's normal that you would struggle to figure out how to answer it. And when people enact microaggressions, they usually mean well, but the impact isn't always good. So it depends on the position you're in, the mood you're in, the type of relationship you have, as to whether or not you want to answer those questions. But it's okay to tell people, I'm happy to have this conversation with you, but I'm going to ask you to read this first, and send them a link. My favorite thing to do is to send people links. Another person says that, I told my mom this and she keeps telling me it is a choice. And yeah, I can empathize. Thanks for sharing that. That is incredibly, incredibly difficult. One thing I've come to say, I say two things. I say, as a young person, I don't think I would have chosen to be made fun of. I was made fun of for my voice, for the way I walked, for the way I talked, for the friends I had. Most of my friends were girls. I got made fun of for not being able to play sports or not fitting in with the guys. I don't think I would have chosen that. So if you think I chose that, you're being silly. And the second thing I would say is, now as an adult, I'm ready to live my life. So do I choose to be gay now? Absolutely. Because I don't have time for this debate. I have a life to get back to. This debate doesn't serve me. This debate only leaves me in a place to continually be defensive and educate and convince another person who doesn't have to live my life. Another comment. I told my mom, when did you choose to be straight? But she keeps on arguing with me that it's a choice. What can I do to convince her? So I hope what I just shared is helpful. Another person says, yeah, these sound so familiar. In the months after I came out as gay, I was constantly asked about how it was going with my problem by my parents, and when I think this will blow over. So like, when do you think you'll be done this phase? When is this whole thing going to be over? And I think that's a common thing that people think. I would say for a lot of us who are LGBTQI, heterosexuality was a phase, right? We participated in it. We pretended. It didn't work out. We're tired of being actors. We moved on. The next one, I find it important to acknowledge that these questions can enforce, increase, or create internalized queer phobia. Absolutely. So each time you're asked these, they might actually make you increasingly not like yourself or want to create distance between yourself and the larger LGBTQI community. So, for example, if somebody says, I want you to try to be straight, or I want you to be less effeminate, or I want you to wear these clothes. So when people try to do reparative things, they make the LGBTQI person feel an increasing amount of shame. And when you feel that much shame, you feel isolated and you distance yourself from other people who could actually be of support. And that does increase your internalized homophobia, transphobia, or queer phobia. Another person says, I'm glad you mentioned HIV and AIDS and that it isn't only relevant to the LGBTI community. Is HIV and STIs underreported in heterosexual communities? Could this be so? And the reason being general shame from various factors in their lives, for instance? That's a complex question. So we have to think about our geographic context. In the global north, so places like Canada, the United States, most of Western Europe, some places in Western Europe, and I would include Australia, even though it's in the global south. Those kinds of quote unquote Western countries We did see in the 80s that gay men were being disproportionately affected by HIV. And the people that were labeled as being at most risk for HIV fell in the category of the 3 H's. Now, this is in North America: homosexuals, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. And of course, you can see right away that there's homophobia embedded in that, but also racism, right? Haitians are Black people and migrants often in the United States. And so as cases are being discovered, you would see that people from a dominant group are like, you stay away from these people. Other people would go as far as to say, as this community is being punished for their wrongdoings or for their unnatural behavior. So you can see how toxic it gets. Now, on the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen that the rates of HIV have been very high in many communities. So it's not just gay men, it's many communities. Now, what is the general reason for HIV transmitting very quickly in any small enclave or community? Well, the reason is that if you live in close proximity and you have a well-knit community, you're going to have sexual partners that are within a smaller group. And when you have sexual partners within a smaller group, that gives a virus more opportunity to transmit within that smaller group of people. So for example, a lot of gay men and LGBTQI people are known for leaving smaller towns and moving to urban centers. And if you live in an urban center, lots of urban centers the world over, including in South Africa, have quote unquote gay-friendly neighborhoods, or what we would call the gayborhood or the gay village or the gay ghetto, depending on where you live. So when you have a population density that intense and a community that sticks to one another, the chance of something transferring is going to be higher. The other factor that leads to higher transmission of something like HIV in particular is the lack of education and the stigma. There's lots of stigma around condom use. There's power dynamics that are difficult in relationships. For example, it can be very difficult for a woman to insist on condom use. A partner might say, "Why? Do you not trust me?" And you might say, "Well, this doesn't really have to do with trust. This just is about basic transmission of HIV." And actually, people who are more likely to transmit the virus are not people who are HIV positive and on treatment. It's people who are HIV positive and don't know their status. So that leads me to the other question, or the other reason for how HIV transmits rapidly is lack of testing services or stigma around testing. So it's not that HIV, AIDS, and other STIs are underreported in heterosexual communities. In general, there's stigma around testing, there's stigma around HIV, there's stigma around sexual health. And I think the same way we go to the doctor to get our other needs met, or you go to a naturopath, or you go get a massage, you should be able to go to a sexual health clinic. We also have to acknowledge that negotiating condom use, contraceptions, and barriers can be difficult in the context of power dynamics and living and having sexual interactions in smaller communities, because somebody might slut shame you, or somebody might talk about trust. People bring up different things that put you at risk of rejection or violence or worse. So the last comment I'm going to read out is, I remember when I came out to my mom and I wanted to educate her because I didn't have all the answers. I referred her to some books and my mom said, "I don't want to learn about gay sex." Yeah, that's so common. And thank you for sharing that. I think this is the challenging thing, that we're not trying to educate somebody else on the ways in which LGBTQI people have sex. We don't want to tell you about that. If you want to know about that, you can watch porn. That's not hard to find. It's not inaccessible. We're trying to tell you about our identity, right? And that's the big piece. And we're not just telling you about our identity as it affects us. I'm telling you about a larger community I'm now part of. And I want your help to get acquainted with that larger community because it's underrepresented and exploited and oppressed and marginalized. So this isn't about who I'm sleeping with. This is about the ways I'm marginalized in the world and how you can be my support. I'm trying to educate you about something you didn't get a chance to learn about before me. So what does it look like to be an ally? People are often like, oh, I'm an LGBTQI ally. Or somebody will say, sorry, I'm going to take a sip of water. Yeah, I accept my child. And I'll say, okay, what does that mean? And they'll say, well, yeah, I love my child. They know I love them. Okay, let's talk about different kinds of allies. So you could be the confidant. The person who is a confidant really tries very hard to provide a safe space for their family member to talk about what they're experiencing. Not just tell me about who you are, but like also tell me about your fears, your needs. What do you need from me? Like, what is it like for you at school? What is it like for you at work? Is there something I can do? Tell me about the stories. Each person has a well of stories, and LGBTQI people have stories about marginalization, meeting other people like them from a very young age. So there's no shortage of stories. And as a confidant, you can create a space to listen to those stories. So being a confidant is about really creating and cultivating safe and trusting relationships. Another kind of ally is a scholar. The scholar is somebody who seeks to learn as much as possible. They go to workshops, they read the manuals we give them, they read the brochures we try to share. They join support groups. When I first came out to my brother, we were at different universities, and he went to the LGBT campus group at his university to get brochures and ask questions. That's an example of a scholar, right? And it's very sweet. It's very endearing. Even if he didn't have answers or he didn't know how to be supportive all of the time, the fact that he did that made a huge difference in our relationship. If you're a scholar, similar to being a confidant, it's less about your own opinions and you're interested in learning. You recognize that there isn't one answer to everything, but that there is a whole world of knowledge and a whole world of stories that you are privileged to be privy to. It's an honor that you get to listen, and you're there to listen and learn from other people's experiences. Maybe you're an amplifier, and an amplifier could be for your sibling, for your spouse, for your child. How do you take what they're saying and make it louder so people can hear? So if they're saying, I really don't want to dress like this when I go to school, or I prefer to pick a career or a course of study that fits, where I won't feel so outcast in terms of my gender expression. Maybe they're saying, I want to take a same-sex partner to an event, but I don't know how to approach the family, or I don't know how to talk to my school about it. The amplifier would say, okay, if that's what you want, you've told me, it's come from you, it's specific to you, I'm going to make that louder and make it heard. What is the upstander? Well, the upstander is the opposite of a bystander. And when we talk about bystanders, we're usually talking about specific incidences of homophobia or transphobia. It can be direct or indirect. You're standing on a train platform, you're waiting for a bus, you're at the grocery store, you're at an Eid event, and somebody says within earshot of you and your loved one, or maybe even just you, something derogatory about LGBTQI people. Says, oh, he's such a girl, or she doesn't know how to be a woman, or that's not how women should dress, or something must be wrong with these people. How could two men get married? The upstander, instead of being a bystander, would actually step in those kinds of situations and be ready for combat. Now, not a big fight, but just to combat or provide a response to offensive comments. So they might turn around and say, actually, you're quite wrong about that. Or they might say, that's a great discussion for you to have, but you really shouldn't have it in public because it's not good for everybody. It's toxic and it's harmful. Have that conversation in private, please. Or you could say, that's homophobic and very harmful. Or you could say, when you talk about women that way or talk about boys that way and you put them in a gender box, it can really affect them for their whole life. You should think about that more. Those are examples of being an upstander. What does it mean to be an advocate? Now, an advocate is somebody who is straight or cisgender and recognizes that as an advocate, they recognize that as a straight or cisgender person, they have more power in some situations. They don't experience the same kind of marginalization. And so they're going to use their power and their influence to educate other people. Whether it's the pastor, the politician, the imam, I've met a number of people in religious communities who've approached me and brought me in to say, hey, I'm finally in charge of this portfolio or this summer camp or this talk series for people who are aging. Rahim, now that I'm in charge, I want you to come in and do a talk on this, that, or the other. So essentially, what they're saying is that I'm going to use my position of power to amplify your voice, but I'm using my influence to educate and advocate. The advocate also recognizes unjust situations and is in a good position to hold people accountable, right? So if you're in a work meeting and some voices are underrepresented or people from underrepresented groups aren't getting an opportunity, the advocate would be able to bring that up without having to worry about how it sounds or how it looks or without having to worry about other repercussions. So these are some examples of what being an ally can look like, right? So if you are a family member or you have somebody, you're an LGBTQI person and you have someone in your life who's an ally, you might find it helpful to think about what category they fit in. It's also helpful to think about, as an ally, who you want to be more of on this list. And if you're an LGBTQI person, you might think about what you need more of from the people in your life, and you might ask that of them. When we think about supporting somebody who's from the LGBTQI community, hopefully after hearing my responses to some of the commonly asked questions, you've got some new ideas, but I'm gonna further reiterate them for you. So number one, if you wouldn't ask a straight or cisgender person a particular question, it's not a good question to ask an LGBTQI person, okay? So when did you come out, or how did you become this way? Did something bad happen to you? Is that why you're gay? This kind of thing. If you wouldn't ask a straight person, don't ask a gay person. Another important assumption is that heterosexuality is not more normal or natural than any other sexual orientation. So nobody should change, and nobody should be told that, something is a test from God or that they're deviant. Heterosexuality is not more normal. It's just more common. That really is it. We have socially gone to great lengths to entrench heterosexuality into our culture. Religion has organized itself around heterosexuality, has created this institution of marriage, has created the family structure in which the only legitimate structure in which a child can be born. The economy has spiraled in a way where you can only afford to own a home if there's two incomes, meaning that you have to, like, relationships are very important. You get tax benefits when you're married. There's all kinds of ways in which society entrenches and reinforces heterosexuality and makes us think it's normal. It's not, it's just common. The third one, people share who they are when the environment feels safe enough to do so. If something is being withheld, it's for safety and protection. So if you think about Sthembiso, he probably didn't have the option to come out. He may not have had the language. He may have anticipated huge rejection from his family at a time when he needed them. maybe he's coming out to his wife now because it feels safe. So it's not only about his end goal, part of it's also her. Where does she see it going? If she says, this isn't going to work for me, we're going to get a divorce, okay. He has to be prepared for that. But what's important is that he feels safe enough now to tell her. Sometimes people will say, why didn't you tell me sooner? And I might say, well, if they told you sooner, and when you ask it that way, either you're upset that they felt they couldn't trust you, or you think that if they told you sooner, you would intervene. When you think you can intervene, that means that you think you can change somebody. When you think you can change somebody, you're sending them a message that they're not good enough or something's wrong with them. That's precisely what leads to LGBTQI youth suicide. So it's good that they didn't tell you. And if you're upset that they didn't feel safe enough to tell you sooner, that's fine. You should be upset with yourself, not them. The next operating assumption, a family member's grief. So grief about who I thought my child was going to be, who I thought my husband was, who I thought, my sister was. There's grief because you're like, things are different. You're not the person I thought you were in many ways. And that grief is perfectly normal, but it should not become the focus after a loved one comes out. So if you really think as a parent you failed, A, don't say that. B, grieve on your own. Because if you make it about you, you take away from somebody else's experience. And finally, it's critical that we all work on dismantling the idea that there's only one way to be in the world. Heterosexuality teaches us that the purpose of life is to be in a relationship, to get married, to have children, to own property, and to pass our name down and pass our wealth down. Those are essentially, I know there's more to heterosexuality. I watch television, but there are these strict timelines that no longer even work for a lot of straight people. So when some people say, nothing's changed about me except the fact that I'm gay or queer, I would say there's more that's changed about you. Because as a queer person, you might come to question all of the things you were taught from a heterosexual framework. And that could include the purpose of life, what you want to do with your time, how you see relationships. You may or may not believe in marriage. You may or may not think there's a need to have children. And I think as people who are allies, we need to really work on our own dismantling, right? So if you're straight and you say, if gay people want to get married, great. But you also have to think about, why do some queer people not want to get married? What do queer and trans people from the margins, what can they teach me about different ways of being in the world? How can I understand a purpose to life that's different from the heterosexual frame? All right, here we go. So questions and answers. I'm going to go right to the chat box and see what is in the chat box. I'll read them out loud. I won't say the person's name, and I'll be happy to respond. One person says, would you say the default heteronormative labeling causes more harm? And how can we break the cycle? Well, I think presuming somebody is heterosexual or cisgender does cause some level of harm. I also recognize that when somebody's born, they're going to be assigned a gender at birth. And I would say, that's fine. That gender is temporary. This child will tell us at age 12 or 13 what their gender actually is. They might confirm something we thought, they might tell us something different. I think we should be open to the idea of our children transgressing gender norms, gender boxes, gender stereotypes, and give them opportunities for everything. I promise you, if you're a straight ally, you will not convince someone to be gay or bisexual or transgender by showing them that opportunity. I can guarantee that. Because I know that I was inundated with every Disney movie you could think of, which was all heterosexual. I was inundated with heterosexual propaganda, if you will. Mind my extreme language, but it's to make a point. And I still was not straight, right? So it's not about convincing people or worrying you're gonna sway them one way or the other. It's keeping the communication open and the culture. It's dismantling the hostility we have to people who deviate from the norm. And in order to do that, we have to challenge our own homophobia and transphobia. And both queer people and straight people are often uncomfortable with deviating from gender stereotypes. So we all have that work to do. We need to break down those gender boxes so that we can create a world that's safer for people. Hopefully that was a good answer for you. The next question, I'm a bisexual youth worker situated in a private Christian high school. I no longer practice religion, but appreciate the value of faith when practiced in a positive, affirming environment. The school officially promotes acceptance and tolerance. The principal, however, recently expressed to me that he does not believe in non-biological gender identity. I went to the same high school, and this was the covert attitude I personally experienced when I openly dated a transgender man. Two of the students I see most often identify as queer or are exploring their sexuality. One of them identifies as gender fluid. They actually attempted to open a discussion regarding gendered uniforms with the principal before I started to work there. I also accidentally discovered that my younger brother, also in this school, is actually romantically dating one of his male friends. With so many LGBTQI people I care about in that environment, how do I best protect them from feeling the shame, disappointment, and disillusionment? Sure. I love this question so much. And also, thank you so much for the work that you do and the ally you're being to these people in your life. I know you're also a queer person, but still, thank you, thank you. It's so important. Look, I think school uniforms are not the worst thing. Even though I come from the West where, a lot of us don't wear school uniforms, but I do think that they need to be degendered, right? There's somebody named Alok Menon. If you follow them on Instagram, they often talk about degendering fashion. And I think that's extremely important, right? There's no reason why a particular cloth shaped to fit legs in any which way should be limited to a particular gender. So I would say, if you're going to have a uniform, let people decide how they want to shape it, what it's going to look like, and give them a variety of options to pick from. There's not one boy uniform and one girl uniform. It's just unacceptable. The second thing is, when somebody says, I don't believe in gender outside of biological gender, I would say great, because gender isn't biological. Sex is biological. That's what you have between your legs. Your gender is what you have between your ears. So that is how you understand yourself. And I would say that we should be really happy that people are brave enough to express their complexity beyond just their assigned gender at birth or their sex, what's between their legs. We're way more than that. The other thing I would say is that, and this is a poignant argument, I think, on the African continent, is that wiping out gender fluidity and entrenching the gender binary is a function of colonialism and white supremacy. So if you don't believe in gender fluidity and multiple genders, essentially, you don't believe in cultural practices that existed before colonization, where, albeit the language was different, multiple kinds of genders were allowed to be expressed. They had different roles in the culture and community. They had ways to be. They were accepted in unique ways. So when we say, I only believe in two genders, that entrenching of the gender binary is actually carrying on the colonial project. And I would say, as a principal of a school, I think it's incumbent upon you in a place that has been affected by racial segregation and colonization multiple times, that we not carry on the legacy of colonization, but in fact, create room in the curriculum to have people experience and talk more, delve deeper into cultural roots of gender fluidity in their own cultures, in the many cultures that exist in South Africa. So I think that's very important. It's not just about the policies at school, it's also about curriculum change. There shouldn't be an English language curriculum that doesn't have books about multiple kinds of relationships and multiple kinds of people. We shouldn't be reading about just European experiences. We should be reading about queer African experiences. And there's many of those. Now, protecting them is difficult. You could do gentle advocacy work. You can do support groups. You could just be there. You could just be the confidant and the advocate for the people that you know that are close to you. You could also suggest that the organization you work with approach that school or the school council or school board to talk about some basic training where those teachers and those principals can get education like a seminar like this, right? By somebody, who they can relate to, where they can explore some of their own biases. So hopefully that was a helpful response. Apart from coming out, how do we protect the LGBTQI community from the violence they face on the daily? Apart from petitions, I feel as though the government isn't doing enough to protect the community. They're not. I agree with you. I think, this past year was the first year ever that Canada, when they did their census, they asked about trans identity. And they were blown away by the response of the number of people that identify as trans or gender non-binary. The way they asked the question was, do you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth? And a whopping huge number said no. This was coincidentally also the year that South Africa did a census, and they unfortunately did not ask that question. And so why am I talking about census? Well, when we talk about numbers, right, as LGBTQI people, we start to be seen as a legitimate community with legitimate needs. And when you put numbers to the size of our community, that means that we can't be ignored and there has to be funding allocated to supports. Now, this isn't just a South Africa problem. Lots of places overlook LGBTQI people. And it's because it promotes a different agenda that keeps us marginalized and keeps our voices more like quieter in a way. So how do we protect communities on the daily? I think we really need to do community mobilization in townships, like anytime somebody is in contact with a social worker or a healthcare worker or any kind of service provider, that provider needs to be in a position to be supportive. If you're doing a youth group that has to do with employment or social skills or anything, having an LGBTQI awareness or positive space button or sticker or something that's inviting can be very important. I think we live in a time where, we can't expect people to A, move into a big city as soon as they experience any homophobia. It's just not viable or affordable. B, we can't expect every LGBTQI people to abandon their religion or their faith. We need to work with faith communities to talk about, like, I would go to a priest, a pastor, an imam, a mulana and say, can you tell me where my people fit into this community? I want you to tell me what is your strategy to help me fit in, and what learning are you doing that's going to make it safe for me to come pray? You can't tell me not to pray. You just can't. You can't tell me not to come to a house of prayer. You just can't. So what are we doing right now to make it safe for people? And what education are we doing? The other question is about race that's here. Does it play a role in how one can come out and the type of support they can receive? Now, I wouldn't say race specifically. I would say culture. I would say economic background. I would say access to education and resources, right? Sometimes we think that, oh, this person comes from a Muslim family, their family's never going to be accepted. I would disagree. I think it absolutely is going to depend on what kind of exposure the family has to other LGBTQI people. That's going to depend on whether or not they've traveled, the kinds of friends they have, the kinds of work they do, the level of education they have. It's about access to information. And sometimes access to information and resources is a function of economic class. So when people from certain cultural communities are not able to ask, or sorry, not able to be supportive, I'm not thinking that, oh, because they're from this religious group or they're from this racial group that they're backwards. No, in fact, doing that feeds into things like Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. I wouldn't want to do that, but I would want to say, I would want to ask, when this community or this family is having trouble expressing acceptance, what is their barrier to accessing good information? What was a barrier for them to get good exposure to other people that are like them who are also LGBTQI? All right, there's another question in the box here. There's a challenge that I myself have experienced and wondered if you could speak of it. I appear and present as heteronormative unintentionally. And the common experience is the comment of, oh, well, you don't look ... I never expected that. I guess this falls into the issue of heteronormativity. And I've used this to essentially be an undercover ally. I feel like the answer to this is to create awareness and break the assumptions of the default sexuality or gender, but I'm aware it's far more complex. Well, it is complex. So if you identify as part of the LGBTQI community, or maybe you just identify as not straight, when people assume that you're heterosexual because of how you look, what you're experiencing is what we call erasure. And there are two sides of this coin. One is the erasure, which is a function of your marginalization, where people within LGBTQI communities might not see you as one of their own, or they might question you when you come into a space, or when you're around straight people, they ask you questions that don't relate to your identity, and you feel a huge weight to have to come out each time. Whereas other people who are more visibly queer, aesthetically, haircuts, maybe they don't fit gender norms and they own it in a way where people make the assumption and it's fine. They don't have to worry about that as much. They don't feel erased in the same way. Now, what's the other side of the coin to erasure? It's the opportunity to be an undercover ally, what we might call, quote unquote, passing privilege, right? So in a work setting or in a family or in an extended family, in a church community, if you were to say, hey, let's talk about LGBTQI inclusion, people aren't going to say, oh, you are just talking about your own cause. You're just talking about the thing that affects you, right? As somebody who's seen as an ally, or as somebody who's seen as having passing privilege, you might be taken seriously in a way that somebody else wouldn't. So that is a way that you can use that privilege. However, I don't want to dismiss how difficult it can be when people have these assumptions. So if you want to have fun with it, if somebody says, oh, I didn't expect you to be gay, you might say, oh, what did you expect? And then they might say, oh, well, you're not like this or you're not like that. And then you might say, oh, I didn't know queer people or gay people or lesbians, whatever, that they all talk a certain way. That's odd, because I don't know your sexual orientation, but I didn't presume that because of the way you walk or talk or dress that you were heterosexual. But that's interesting. And so if you say it like that, it is slightly passive aggressive, but also like funny for you, right? And it might make the other person feel a little bit silly. And I think that's fine to do sometimes. All right, I think I've gotten through all the questions in the Q&A. Now, I know somebody asked for information about supports for people who are within South Africa. So there are a number of them. I would first start by going to the website for Gala Queer Archives. Gala is an organization that does a lot of advocacy work for LGBTQI people across the country. They also have an office in Braamfontein where they host a print archive of the history of LGBT LGBTQI activism in South Africa. If you're looking for books and resources, you don't have to go far. Places like at 44 Stanley, the Bioscope is often showing films with queer themes. So that can be very helpful. If you're in Cape Town, there is the Triangle Project. There's also look up We the Brave SA for sexual health needs and testing information. There's also the ANOVA Health Institute. If you're a gay man or people who are part of the LGBTQI community more broadly, there's Engage Men's Health. So those are some of the names that are coming to my mind off the top of my head. There are more LGBTQI groups and organizations within South Africa. I'm now going to invite Stephanie back.
Rahim, yes, just thank you so much for these informative webinars. I think you have definitely taken us out of the bang, and anybody who has managed to join us for all 4 sessions, I think is definitely left feeling a little more informed and ready to sort of tackle what we need to in the world. Please feel free to follow us on social media. We're happy to connect with you there. Rahim has also shared some of his social media links in the chat box. Give him a follow. You can see the work that he's doing while he's in South Africa, as well as some of the work that he does while he's in Canada. And so, yeah, just thank you all so much for joining us, for interacting, for sharing your opinions, your experiences, and spending this time with us this evening. Thank you all.